viewers, Happy New Year. New year, new topic, carbon cycle and energy security. Right then, what are we going to learn? Well, I'm going to introduce you to the carbon cycle. You're going to learn where most of the carbon is stored on Earth and the most significant stores. The most significant fluxes between the stores. So where are the significant transfers? Where are the significant transfers? Where do they take place? Between which stores? And then we can think of the carbon cycle as kind of a cycle within a cycle. So there's kind of two sub-cycles operating within the whole one. Alright? And if we look at the spec, it's kind of broken up by that a little bit. So 6.1 is concerned with the geological carbon cycle, which is very slow and takes place over a longer period of time. Alright? Whereas as biological carbon cycle, through the oceans and on land, tends to be a lot quicker. So we need to understand the whole thing, but then we need to understand the differences between these two subcycles. These keywords are in your booklet, so I don't need you to write them down. If you were in lesson this week, this is going to seem a little bit like Groundhog Day, because you might have covered some of these, but there were quite a few people missing, so I'm going to start by just, as quick as I can, going over what we did in the first lesson before we move on. So, yeah. Okie dokie. Right, let's kick off then. Right, and if you were missing last lesson, then I just want you to do the same activity as the students that were in the lesson at the time. You might not know anything about the carbon cycle, that's fine. What I want you to do, I want you to get thinking like geographers. I want you to study this, I want you to study the key, the title, you know, what the arrows might mean, the labels, that's all I'm going to say. And use your understanding of the water cycle and think, well, what are the similarities between the hydrological cycle, the water cycle, and the carbon cycle? And then I want you to think, well, you know, you're over three quarters of the way through your A-level course. You know, when you see some of these words and when you study this carbon cycle in front of you, you know, it should be kind of triggering links to other topics in your brain. So what do you see? How you can link it to other topics. Pause the video, have a think, go. Right then, similarities with the water cycle. Well, first of all, you can see we've got reservoirs, stores, or stocks of carbon like we have in water. Other similarities with water: carbon is stored in the atmosphere, in the oceans, on land, and also in dead and living things, just like water is. You can also see by these arrows that presumably these are saying that it's changing stores, or it's fluxing between the stores. Alright, just like the water cycle as well. They were the main ones. Synoptic links to other topics, links to coasts through weathering and erosion. You've got erupting volcanoes, linking to tectonic hazards topic. What else we got? You might link it to superpowers with resource, kind of access to resources and energy. Alright, so you know, when you look at things from, well, you should have been doing it from the start of the course, but particularly now you've studied a lot of the topics, you know, it should be kind of clicking a little bit. You should be thinking, yeah, that's familiar, I've studied that in regeneration, or I've studied that in coasts. Right then, so if you were in lesson, you don't need to write this, you've already wrote it in class. If you weren't here, then you do. So what is the carbon cycle? Well, it's the exchange of carbon between the atmosphere, the terrestrial biosphere, which just means living things on land, oceans, and sediments and rocks. Alright, so we get fluxes between those four major stores. It's found in us, in people, in animals, in rocks, in sediments, in water, in the oceans, in the atmosphere, and it's one of the most abundant elements on Earth. So it's vital for life. We're partly made up of carbon, but it provides a regulatory kind of function when we're thinking about the temperature or the climate of planet Earth. So without greenhouse carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, planet Earth would be a lot colder than what it is now. So we need greenhouse gases such as carbon to keep us all from freezing to death, which we obviously don't want. How is it stored then? Well, first thing you need to know is that the four major stores are the oceans, and it's stored in the oceans as CO2, which is dissolved into the oceans through diffusion. It's stored in the atmosphere as a gas, which is carbon dioxide and methane. So similar to the water cycle, different states, yeah? Gas, liquid. It's stored in the biosphere as living and recently dead organisms that are kind of rotting or decaying. And then the lithosphere, which is basically the sphere of rocks. So it's stored as carbonates in limestone, and then as fossil fuels like coal, oil and gas. How do we measure it? Well, because there's that much carbon on planet Earth, we're talking big numbers, and so we tend to refer to them as pentagrams, which means 1 billion tons or 1 trillion kilograms. What this unit means, I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but it is relative. Yeah. Right then. Right, whether you're in last lesson or not, this is the new stuff, so you need to be paying attention. Right, so the first sub-cycle is the geological carbon cycle, and a couple of keywords I'm going to talk you through. These are in your booklet, so you don't need to write them down. You can do if you like, because some of these keywords are actually processes which are vital in this geological carbon cycle. So the first one is weathering, which is the breakdown of rocks in situ, so where they are located. Erosion, remember, is the removal of that weathered material. So don't be using the word erosion in this part of the course. It's weathering that is the key kind of process. Lithification is where rocks are formed. All right. In particular, kind of when sediments sink to the seabed, they build up and they get compacted under pressure, and they turn from a sediment and they get pressed into a solid rock. An example would be limestone. That's the key one for this topic. Yep, limestone, sedimentary rock. Dissolution and diffusion, well, this is the process that happens in the surface level of the oceans, where CO2 is absorbed and dissolved by the oceans. And the oceans can also actually release it back into the atmosphere. Volcanic outgassing, geography phrase really for volcanoes erupting and releasing CO2 back into the atmosphere. Alright, so these are in your booklets, I just thought I'd mention them. Right, first thing I'm going to kind of touch on is the carbon cycle at first glance. It's very easy to get lost in it. It's very easy to get kind of bamboozled, confused, whatever. And just like I said last lesson, if you're ever confused, ever bamboozled, take a step back. Context is everything. And look at that, and it becomes far more simpler. So at times in the course, we're going to be getting a little bit in depth what's happening in the oceans, right? And it is quite complex, and students do struggle with it. So, if you're kind of getting bogged down, take a step back. Yeah, that's what I would say. We're going to get into the role of the soil and what soils do in the carbon cycle. Again, take a step back if you're getting confused. And on that note, there's lots of different graphics that I'd have a practice at studying a lot of them if I were you. The carbon cycle will be shown in lots of different ways. This way is the biological cycle. Looks simple. again, biological cycle, slightly different. This is the geological cycle. Alright. And then we could go for both. And show kind of the rate of the fluxes and the most significant stores. And I'm going to pull that one back up in a sec. We could go for a more kind of systems or flow based diagram. Yeah. All this is the same thing. We could go for a graphic that just focuses on the fluxes and the rate of exchanges between the four major stores, and it loses a lot of detail, this one, because you've not got, you know, it's nowhere near as detailed as that one I've just kind of pulled up, but this one does a different job. So if, yeah, so, you know, you're going to see it displayed in lots of different ways. If ever you're struggling and you think, God, I'm lost, what did I tell you to do? Go back to the front cover of your booklet and figure out which bit of this it is that you're actually focusing on. Yeah, so context is everything. It's easy to get lost. Right then, the geological carbon cycle. Let's have a look at this. Here we go. I'm going to use this one. Right. So, what's going off here? Well, the first thing to say is the fluxes and the transfers are over a very long period of time. Alright, you can be talking hundreds of thousands, millions, hundreds of millions of years. So what's happening? Where do you want to start? Let's have a look. Remember, it is a sub-cycle, so you could start anywhere really on this diagram. I'm going to start, let's have a look. I'm going to start here. No particular reason, I just fancied it. Right then, so CO2 is released. Give me my pen, for God's sake. Here we go. I'm not giving me my pen. So carbon is released as CO2, which is a gas, into the atmosphere through volcanic outgassing, step 1. Alright. Right. At this point, a couple of things can happen. The first thing is it can diffuse into the oceans where marine animals or marine creatures use dissolved CO2 in the oceans to build their shells. Alright, so any marine creature with a shell, it's converted into a carbonate, and they can transfer that into the shells. They then die and sink to the seabed. And then we get this process of lithification, where it builds up over a long period of time. It compresses, turns into limestone or other sedimentary rocks, and we get lithification. And then what can happen is, again, synoptic link to plate tectonics. That limestone is subducts at a subduction zone into the asthenosphere or upper mantle. It gets a lot hotter. It partially melts and releases CO2 as a gas. Pressure builds, and then it needs to vent, and it does so through volcanic outgassing. Alright, so that's one kind of part of this. The other one is limestone can, through again tectonic uplift, synoptic link to coasts and tectonics, this lithified, or lithified, is that a word? I'm not sure, who cares? This limestone can be uplifted into mountain ranges. And incidentally, one of the case study examples for this is one of the largest terrestrial stores on Earth is actually the Himalayan mountain range. Alright, limestone that's been uplifted to form the Himalayas. So that is also a carbon store. And then what can happen to mountains and rocks? Well, they can get weathered by acid rain. Weathered by acid rain, and rivers then can, through erosion and transportation, can transport that carbon back into the oceans. All right, and yeah, in lesson I'm going to get into the kind of the like sciencey bit, kind of what type of carbon it is and the chemical compounds and things, but I'm not going to do that at this moment in time. So yeah, study that. If you need to play it back, do so, and create you could create like a flow diagram or even a couple of flow diagrams. Yep. Also, it's worth noting that carbon dioxide can be released at mid-ocean ridges as well. Yep. So it's released in the atmosphere through volcanic outgassing and at divergent plate boundaries. Now, one of the learning objectives was the kind of differences in speed and the speed of the fluxes. Well, if you think about these processes, weathering, slow process, mountain uplift, slow process, subduction and lithification, yeah, it takes millions of years for limestone to form. Very, very slow process. The two instant processes within this cycle are the very fast ones, volcanic outgassing and release of CO2 along mid-ocean ridges. But generally speaking, this is, most of the fluxes are really slow. Yeah, that's the key thing. And this is kind of the part of the carbon cycle which is really good at keeping in balance. It's in negative feedback. So if there is a short-term increase in CO2 because there's been a large volcanic eruption, there might be a kind of short-term shock, but then gradually over time it will rebalance itself. Alright? Right then. This you will find in your booklet, so I don't need you to draw this one, but I mean this is a kind of systems-based flow diagram of the carbon cycle. And if we're just focusing on the geological carbon cycle, well, what bits have we just covered? We've covered carbon in the atmosphere, how it can exchange and flux between the oceans and the atmosphere. We have covered weathering and tectonics and how it's stored in rocks. We've also covered lithification as well, where rocks are kind of formed, yep, such as limestone. So, yep, we've not touched on anything really that's living, have we? Especially kind of terrestrial, land-based living part of the carbon cycle. Yep. So the challenge is whenever you see a different graphic, is to think, right, well, which part of the carbon cycle is this? Yep. And if you're ever stuck, take a step back and look at the first one. One thing I did forget to do at the very start, and before I kicked on, is those of you that weren't here last lesson, then where are the four major stores? Well, just have a look. This is the carbon cycle shown with its fluxes and size of stores in pentagrams. Blue is obviously the stores, red is your processes and your fluxes, which are shown in the units on. So yeah, the key point is most of the Earth's carbon is, the vast majority of it actually, if you look at these numbers, is found in the geological carbon cycle, right? It's rocks, it's the Earth's crust, it's limestone, yeah, it's slate, not slate, forgot the word, I'll come back to it later. The oceans, the atmosphere, and soils. Yep. So they're the four major stores. Where are the most significant fluxes taking place? Well, dissolution and diffusion between the oceans and the atmosphere. Also photosynthesis and respiration. Yep, they are the most significant fluxes. So plants photosynthesizing and sequestering carbon from the atmosphere and turning it into biomass and sugars, and dissolution and diffusion, uptake and loss between the oceans. And this graphic that I'm about to pull up does a better job of showing that, actually. Let's have a look. Yeah, so key stores: ocean, vegetation and soil, atmosphere, and rocks. So key fluxes, if you look, we've got plants that photosynthesize. These arrows are the wrong way somebody who designed this graphic didn't get the arrows quite right. So photosynthesis sequesters carbon out of the atmosphere into the plants. Respiration releases CO2 back into the atmosphere. So for instance, humans, what do? We take in oxygen and we breathe out CO2 through the process of respiring. Again, the oceans, dissolution and diffusion. And if you look at these, the key thing is, if you look at these blue arrows, generally speaking, they're in balance. Yeah, there's not much between them. It's a negative feedback system, dynamic equilibrium. It's in balance. And if we think of the anthropogenic activities such as deforestation and burning fossil fuels, yeah, it doesn't seem that significant at first when you think of the size of the fluxes and the stores, but 6.4 pentagrams being released through burning fossil fuels, yeah, can actually kind of kick this system out of balance very slowly. Yep, there we go. Right, my students, again, there's some keywords that are going to be key when we look at the biological cycle. Bad joke. So again, the biological cycle is just a kind of sub-cycle of that one. Yeah, so we're just going to focus on the living part of it. So here we go. Let's pull this to front. Right. Again, loads of different ways, loads of graphics we can choose to show it. Involves living things, this one. It's not just all about rocks. Yeah. So the key processes of photosynthesis and respiration. So yeah, if we take forests, plants, trees, vegetation, what do? Keyword, they sequester carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Look at this for drawing. They sequester it out of the atmosphere during photosynthesis. Alright. They then turn that, as part of that, into organic matter. So when they grow, they'll turn it into biomass and energy and sugars. And if you do A-level biology, you'll be loving this and you'll be finding it super easy. Yeah. From there, it can be passed along the food chain to your primary consumers. So along comes a caterpillar or a rabbit, eats the grass and eats the trees. Yeah. They then transfer that carbon from the tree into their bodies, and then it's passed up the food chain. Along comes a fox and eats the rabbit. Oh dear, it's not very nice, is it? Yeah, so it's passed up into the food web. All right, that's why all living plants and animals contain carbon as living matter. Yeah, and then we eat the. If you're not a vegetarian or a vegan, we eat the cattle, cows, pigs, whatever, and that carbon's then transferred to us as well, so into the food web. But there's a couple of other processes that are happening as well. If you look at this one, it's kind of when things die, so trees die, animals die, plants die, and they turn into what's called detritus, or decomposed material. So rotting flesh, rotting trees. And through decomposition then we end up as soil as part of the nutrient cycle. And from that point, carbon, when something dies, like a forest or a person, it respires and releases CO2 back into the atmosphere. Alright? Now if we think of the times or the speed of the fluxes compared to the geological time scale, just have a think about how they're going to differ. So how fast does photosynthesis happen? Yeah, how fast does respiration happen? How fast does carbon get passed up through the food web? Yep, think of the speed of how fast things decompose and turn into soil. Yep, have a think about that. Right, a couple of other points then. The amount of carbon cycled, this is a key fact, this, through annually is 1,000 times greater than the geological carbon cycle or subcycle. Alright, so this is much faster. Yep, and I'm not saying it's more significant necessarily, but it's much faster. The speed of fluxes are a lot quicker. Alright. Yeah, more simplified version. Like I say, I like to show you 2 or 3 graphics that show the same thing just in a slightly different way, because then you can tackle anything if you can do that, rather than just focus on the one that your teacher gives you. Get out there and have a look at different ones, see if you can make sense of them. So yeah, this shows exactly the same as the last one, really. All right. Again, anthropogenic activity. How are humans involved in kind of altering this? Well, if you think when dinosaurs roamed, plants and animals roamed the earth, and then they died, over millions of years they turn into coal, oil and gas, fossil fuels. We come along and start burning those through combustion. Also, we can deforest trees, for instance, and burn those instantly as well. And the process of combustion, again, when we actually burn those materials, is instant. It's an instant flux that pumps CO2 into the atmosphere. So the speed of fluxes, you can see, is important as well. Yep. Right then, so some keywords that we should have just covered, really. Decomposition, it's when dead organic plants and animals are broken down into the soil as part of the nutrient cycle and is essential for recycling. Photosynthesis is the process used by plants, and also there are phytoplankton in the oceans which do it as well, which we're going to get onto in the next lesson. But yeah, so they harness energy from sunlight and turn it into chemical energy when they photosynthesize. We've got transfers and fluxes that happen over the ocean through dissolution and diffusion, where the oceans can either absorb and dissolve CO2, or they can also release it back into the atmosphere. Make a note of this, because this is important. Carbon sequestration. We touched on it last lesson. Oops. It's when carbon dioxide is taken or sequestered out of the atmosphere into a sink. Alright? Photosynthesis is the process, or one of the main ones, that causes sequestration. And some of the sinks can be oceans, forests, soils. And again, if we think of this idea of negative feedback and dynamic equilibrium, it's vital, because if it wasn't for carbon sequestration and photosynthesis, the amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere would just keep increasing. Yeah. So this helps to keep it in balance. Right. So the cycle within a cycle then, the two sub-cycles, the speed of things, speed of fluxes, sorry, I'm not on it today folks, I've had a Christmas break, I've lost my touch with these videos I think, but I'm not doing it again. Yeah, plants and the biological part of the carbon cycle, where you're thinking in terms of photosynthesis, respiration, decomposition, it's very quick, yeah? And there's some factors what affect how quick this is, and we're going to look at those, and we're going to link it to different places on the planet as well, and different biomes, which you're going to find super interesting. But yeah, this generally speaking is a very fast part of the carbon cycle. Oceans, carbon held in dissolved form and in sediments on the ocean floors can be stored for an extremely long time, and it's a bit slower. Alright, the slowest part of the carbon cycle is the geological cycle, where long held stores in the Earth's surface are released. Yeah, they take a very, very long time to form and turn from sediments, lithify into limestone, get subducted, and then be released through volcanic outgassing. The only thing that I would say is, when that volcanic outgassing does happen, it happens instantly. Yeah, volcano erupts, it's very quick, isn't it? But the actual, most of the other part of that geological cycle is very slow. Right, folks, you can watch this back if you need to. I kept my part at bargain, it's not longer than half an hour, so read it back, make sure you're A-OK with everything, bring notes, have any questions ready, off you go, see you later.